7.8 million visitors, 500,000 objects, 60,600 meters square. This is what a museum is about. The Louvre is a powerhouse of museums. It is not surprising to see it ranked as the world's best museum. And let me do a little experiment to show how famous it really is. What can you think of when I say the Metropolitan? Perhaps a city. What can you think of when I say the British? Perhaps the people in Britain. You can only know I'm referring to the Metropolitan Museum in New York after I've added the word museum. The same goes for the British Museum. The Louvre, on the other hand, is so audacious that it let go of itself completely. National, institution, gallery, these are all redundant descriptions. What you need to know is Louvre. Louvre itself is sufficient. The monolithic structure stands right in the center of the art realm. But it would be boring just to talk about a museum. So let me introduce a series to you. A series that I found out last year. It's called Bande dessinée Louvre, or BD Louvre. The direct translation literally means Comic Louvre. It is a series started by a Louvre museum curator, Fabrice Dour. A series that surprisingly have been ongoing for almost 20 years now. The intention of this project is to invite manga and comic artists to create a story which is related to the Louvre. You can create whatever you want. The museum will not dictate the length or the material of the comic/manga. As long as it is tangentially related to the Louvre, you will get a pass publishing it. It is a collaboration project between the museum and the world of comics. It is a collaboration that makes sense, since comic book is a rising art form in France. The artists who are chosen to collaborate have this special chance to walk around the Louvre. And I'm not talking about visiting the Louvre in opening hours. The artists can look at the behind-the-scenes stuff, and they can visit the Louvre even when it is closed. If they want, they can even stay overnight. So, with all this in mind, I want to talk about some of those comics that I have read from BD Louvre. I went in with a blind eye to these mangas and comics, but in my mind, it is obvious that the series will contain discussion on art collections. After all, what is a museum if it is not about its own collection? This sentiment is echoed in the very first comic that I have read. Themuseumvaults is the second published comic in the series. It is about a man, an expert, who went into a half-ruined museum. And in one of the scenes, the expert encountered another character who was sleeping in a mold. The mold is used to create curiosity, but somehow it fits perfectly for the man. It is as if the museum is so great that you will be able to find any form of collection, even the collections that mimic your body. And this scene is extra memorable for me because of frequency illusion, a cognitive bias in which a person notices a specific concept, word, or product more frequently after recently becoming aware of it. You see, I was reading another series when I started to read BD Louvre. It is a comic series called theobscurecities, and coincidentally, the creators of theobscurecities, BenoîtPeeters and François Choutin, wrote a story called The Louvre Passage. I discovered this accidentally, because this is a bonus story that got published alongside with the series of the Obscure Cities. The creators were also given a chance to have a tour in the Louvre, just like the artists in BD Louvre. But the difference is, they had made these stories way before BD Louvre became a thing. So it is interesting to discover the Louvre has always tried to connect the comic world. But what's more interesting is how similar some of the story's elements are. In the Louvre's passage, a man was trying to escape, but when he was escaping, he found something odd. He discovered people in the Louvre made an exact sculpture of his own body. These two panels echo the same thing in my mind. A museum is a collection of all the things in the world, and the best museum can even capture you, your human body. This idea is not that far off when you realize the philosopher Voltaire missed a tooth in his remain. I know he missed a tooth because it was kept by another man, Bevon Dannen, the very first director of the Louvre Museum. Dannen had all kinds of things: the mustache of Henry IV, bones of La Fontaine and Molière, and a drop of Napoleon's blood, which is quite weird if you think about it, because it was Napoleon who appointed him to be the first director of the Louvre. Knowing these little fun facts really put things into perspective. Of course, a great museum will be in charge by someone who hoards all kinds of things. But if we think about it, it seems that no one is going to the Louvre to see the remains of famous people. Most of the famous exhibitions are objects. Yes, the Louvre is a museum, but it is an art museum. And artwork doesn't decay. The embodiment of the human spirit are channeling within those collections. This is why we should ask, what is a museum if it is not about its own collection? This sentiment is echoed in the very first comic that I have read. Themuseumvaults is the second published comic in the series. It is about a man, an expert, who went into a half-ruined museum. And in one of the scenes, the expert encountered the oldest artifact in the world. It is the oldest known example of a mold, a mortise rock. It is situated deep inside the cave of the museum. It is so shut off that even light can't reach it. Upon such an encounter, a character said, "Is our gaze still capable of grasping the magic of the oldest artifacts?" And this scene is extra memorable for me because of frequency illusion, a concept that you might have heard of. You see, I was reading another series when I started to read BD Louvre. It is a comic series called theobscurecities. And not only did I find out the creators made a side story called the Louvre Passage, but I also found out the story, the tower, has some similar story element to the museum vault. In that story, a man was assigned with a task of taking care of a tower that humanity has built for as long as one can remember. They do that so that they can reach the top, reach the light. But a protagonist started to question the essence of his task, so he went down instead of up and walked into a painting, an old painting of the past, a portal to another reality. These stories echo the same things in my mind. A museum is not just a collection of things. It is also related to the spirit of the past. This idea is not that far off when you realize the philosopher Voltaire is part of the 86th statue of the illustrious man. And this spirit of the past are looking down on Louvre. Knowing these little fun facts really put things into perspective. After all, if cemetery gathers the collection of the human bodies, then museum is the sepulchre of the human spirits. This is the final resting place where the remarkable ones converge and meet. So it shouldn't be surprising for me to tell you that a lot of the Louvre comics have supernatural elements to it. For example, we can see it in Rohan at the Louvre, the manga that was created by the creator of JoJo, Hirohiko Araki. He was also one of the artists who collaborated with the Louvre. The manga depicts a painting which was haunted by a ghost, haunted by the past. Hirohiko Araki is not the only one who wrote stories about ghosts. The French artist Enki Bilal created this comic called Phantoms of the Louvre. It is a comic about how 22 ghost spirits are possessing the artifacts of the Louvre. All these ghosts and spirits are made-up characters. They have never existed in the real-life history. But Enki Bilal tried to reimagine how these people affected the artwork that we see now by going back to the time when the artworks were made. For example, the winged victory of Samothrace is a famous statue in Louvre, but no one knows who made it. So he made up a character called Aloysius Averto as the creator. and he reimagined the origin of the statue. This is not the only time Winged Victory of Samothrace has something spiritual going on. The manga artist Jiro Taniguchi also made a story about Louvre, and this time, the Winged Victory of Samothrace itself came to life. The list of spirits that comes to life is really more common than you think for this series. But if we think about it, it seems that we are missing something that is right in front of our face. Let me put it in this way. Writing stories about how artwork is processed by its creator, or how the artwork comes to life, these are the most intuitive way to write stories about art, because an object has no voice. This has the same energy as giving animal human characteristic. It is too obvious, too straightforward, lacking a bit of flavor in creativity. If we want to stand among the crowd and create something special, then why don't we link it to something unique? If you still don't understand what I mean, then let me give you a hint. Where is the Louvre in BD Louvre? I've been talking about the Louvre for a while now, but you still probably don't know who built it and when was it built. On top of that, do you see what is a problem if, let's say, I publish a comic book that talks about a duplicate of Leonardo da Vinci in the future and call it Leonardo 2 in 2019 in an effort to collaborate with the Louvre Museum? Well, the problem is, you can see the work of Leonardo da Vinci in other places too. Then, why don't we just link the artwork and the museum together? This is why when the museum folk plotline talks about how you can find the oldest artifact hidden deep in the museum, it felt a bit strange. It's almost suggesting the Great Museum has been holding the artifact this whole time. But the thing is, the Louvre was not a museum. It was a fortress. This left us with the question, what is a museum if it is not about its own collection? This sentiment is echoed in the very first comic that I've read. The Museumvaults is about a man, an expert, who went into a half-ruined museum. And in one of the scenes, what we see in the museum is not the collections, it's not the artworks, but a wall. A city wall. What's so interesting about this wall is the fact that it's not a museum protecting the heritage of an archaeological site. The museum itself is the wall. The Louvre was built in the 12th centuries for defensive purposes. The Louvre is so old that it has actually outlived one of its most famous exhibitions. It was built and rebuilt. It has faced reconstructions and destructions. It was born as a fortress, metamorphosed into a palace, and now lands itself as a museum. Its history is rich, and this scene is extra memorable for me because of frequency illusion, a common sense concept. You see, I was reading another series when I started to read BD Louvre. It's a comic series called theobscurecities, and the creator had made a side story called The Louvre Passage and a story called The Tower in the Past. But this kind of information probably isn't very helpful in explaining the series. To put it simply, the series is about encountering cities with strange and fantastical tales. A lot of the times, these cities have buildings and structure so majestic that they go beyond the human imagination. And in one of the series stories, The Fever in Urban Conde, we have a character who tries to restructure the city. And he has this one memorable quote: "My work isn't meant for the here and now. It's meant for prosperity. Built of stone, it will outlast politics and speeches." Outlasting politics and speeches. What a coincidence. Because it's such a fitting line for the Louvre. It was, after all, first built with stones. And if you have any understanding of Louvre history, you will certainly see why it outlasts politics and speeches. Henry IV, the King of France, was the one who ordered to build Grande Gallery for the Louvre. It was designed to be 460 meters long, making it the longest building in Paris at that time. However, Henry IV did not have much time to appreciate his own creation. In 1610, 3 years after Grand Gallery was built, he met his fatal end. He was assassinated, and he died while he was rushing back to the Louvre Palace, a creator who died right before he reached his creation. If we really want a good story about the Louvre, then how is there a better one than this one? This will only be one of the many political turmoils that Louvre have experienced in its lifetime. The Louvre also witnessed how people in France went from making speeches about revolution to reinstating an emperor decades later. And both of these historical legacies are recorded and collected by none other than Louvre itself. As you can see, it's very easy to think of Louvre as just a museum, a singular point in time and space. But just like many other things, it has its own past. And just like Rome, it was not built in a day. There were a lot of ups and downs in order to transform the Louvre that we see today. This museum is not just a collection of things. It is also an embodiment of change in society. This idea is not that far off when you realize the philosopher Voltaire once commented this in 1749. Passing before the Louvre, we sigh as we look at the facade, that monument to the grandeur of Louis XIV, to the ambitions of Colbert, to the genius of Perrault, concealed behind the buildings of Goths and Vandals. In this writing, Voltaire was trying to lament the changes that society was doing to the Louvre, and portray the ambitions of Jean-Baptiste Colbert and the genius of Claude Perrault. Both were one of the many designers who once worked on the Louvre. It was understandable for Voltaire to say that because during that period, some constructions of the Louvre Palace was ground to a halt. Though the overall structures were completed, it still lacked doors, window panes, floors, and ceilings. So heaps of snows and puddles of waters would submerge into the buildings. This situation lasted for 130 years. And when Voltaire made his comment, we were just 70 years into this dereliction. The statement from Voltaire would also resonate with another art critic, Etienne Lafont de Saint-Yen. In his work, The Shade of the Great Colbert, he imagined an allegorical conversation between the Louvre, the city of Paris, and Colbert himself. Through his work, he wanted to express our inadequate care for the Louvre Palace. He also would be one of the first public intellectuals to against the transformations of the Louvre from a palace to a museum. This long-changing history of the Louvre is why I had a strong affinity for one of the lines of the BD Louvre manga, Mujirushi, The Sign of Dreams. Each wall that tells of a long-forgotten palace, wire and pipes crawling around as if they were blood vessels. It depicts the Louvre as this ancient sentient being who has experienced a lot and has grown a lot, a testament of time. And there's no better way to witness this change of time than by using art itself. If you want to know what the Louvre was like in its original form, you can search for a painting. If you want to look at the Tuileries Palace, the part of Louvre that got burned down in 1871, you can search for a photo. If you want to look at the Louvre during the French New Wave era, you can search for a film. Each of these correspond to different kinds of art form, and each of these art form was formed thanks to the progressions of time. The Louvre and art are accompanying each other. With this progression of time, maybe it is time for a new art form to record the progressions of Louvre, and not render it as a background object. But here is the thing. The Louvre has evolved so much that it no longer has any personalities. If the Louvre was still a fortress, then it might still attract artists like the Neuschwanstein Castle. If it is still a palace, then it might attract artists like the Versailles Palace. But a museum is meant to be invincible. no one goes to the museum to see the museum. It's always about the exhibition. This problem is way deeper than you think, because no one will buy BD Louvre if it is about Louvre and not Mona Lisa. This brings us to the topic of what is a museum if it is not about its own collection. This sentiment is echoed in the very first comic that I have read. The Themuseumvaults is about an expert who went into a half-ruined museum, and in one of those scenes, we see the expert passing away. Only in his dying breath, he realized his name is an anagram of Louvre Museum. It's like a revelation. If a museum comes to life, then he can only recognize himself when he is no longer one, when he stopped being a museum. And because of frequency illusion, I pick up a topic about museum elsewhere. You see, the creators of the obscure cities were trying to preserve and restore one of the architecture from Victor Horta. I found this out accidentally when I was reading the afterwords of their work. And just like BD Louvre, BenoîtPeeters and François Schoutin tried to feature this historical structure in the work. But if you ask me, I think this building suffered the same fate as the Louvre. It mostly just exists and adds nothing to the story. It's like looking at the pyramid of the Louvre and say, that's cool, and that would be the end of the conversation. At the end, what people care about is what's going on inside the Louvre. It sounds fine on the surface level, until you realize what makes Louvre famous does not belong to Louvre. In 1963, Mona Lisa was being shown to the public as usual. But the difference is, this time, Mona Lisa was in the US. One of the Louvre's most famous exhibitions could just be gone. Now, this kind of practice is of course nothing new. Museums borrow each other's artwork from time to time. But what is relatively new is the idea of a non-collecting museum. It is the idea that museum should not have a permanent accession collection. Instead, it could be a constant exchange of artworks from a number of museums so that people can experience fresh new work from time to time. Remember, the Louvre is not like Andy Warhol Museum. The name Louvre itself does not guarantee you any particular kind of art. It's possible that the staple that you want to see will not be in the Louvre for the future. It raises an interesting hypothetical question. If the Louvre no longer has its staple artwork, hell, maybe even zero artwork, then what story can the Louvre tell? Well, let me tell you that this hypothetical question is not so hypothetical, because during the Second World War, the Louvre was empty to prevent any kind of damage to the artwork, and this historical event is depicted in the manga Guardian of the Louvre. You might think, since there are no more artwork in the Louvre, it would then shift our gaze back to Louvre itself. But that's not the case. Even when the artwork are out of the Louvre, it is still about the artwork. It talks about how hard it was to preserve and protect the art during the World War. But none of the work that I've read talks about how hard it is to preserve and protect the Louvre for 900 years. Because to them, the Louvre become just a museum. Louvre is nothing but a familiar name. Speaking of name, let's talk about the power of naming. Do you know, according to the Proto-Indo-European language, the etymology of the word truth is based on the idea of a tree, because truth is firming and solid. And do you know the word is in Chinese is a combination of the words wood and the sun? Even when it comes to something as abstract as truth and ease, we can still find their grounding in the concrete world. So it is curious to know the origin of the name Louvre. And to the surprise of many, the answer is no one really knows. A French antiquary, Henry Sauval, said it comes from the Anglo-Saxon word lova, which is a word that is barely seen by any. It apparently means castle. This explanation is most likely wrong because many of the so-called contemporaries believe that the Louvre was built in the 6th centuries. Some say that it's originated from the word Louvre, which means she-wolf. It has this name because it was once believed that the land was once occupied by wolves. So the audacious Louvre, the one which does not even need to use the word museum to identify itself, has a name that no one knows the meaning of. The mysterious origin prompts us a good question. How do we define the Louvre? If we go by the name origin, we don't know what it means. If we look at the history, then it was a fortress, a palace, and now a museum. This idea of indeterminism is related to philosophy when you realize the philosopher Nietzsche once said, "Only that which has no history can be defined." But you might be thinking, why would I want to define the Louvre? To answer that, we need to take a detour and talk about Nike. I'm sure that you must have heard of this shoe company, but do you know when the company's first employee, Jeff Johnson, suggested the name Nike in a meeting 5 hours right before the shipment was due, the president at that time just replied, "What is a Nike?" It's a fair question, because I wonder how many of you would know Nike is the name of a Greek goddess, the goddess of victory. And the thing is, if you search Nike online, you will only find the image of shoes. The name Nike has taken a new life form. It lost its original meaning. Now it's just a brand name for consumer to get attached to. It's quite ironic, because you have seen Nike in this video. Winged Victory of Samothrace is a famous statue in Louvre, and you can see it everywhere in BD Louvre. But another name for this statue is Nike of Samothrace. Even the most famous collection in Louvre is overshadowed by a brand name, and it is nowhere to be seen online. And the thing that is happening to Nike is also happening to Louvre. What you are looking at right now is a museum in Abu Dhabi. It's certainly beautiful, but what I want to focus on is the name. It's called the Louvre Abu Dhabi. The France and UAE signed an agreement and allowed the museum to use the name Louvre until 2037. And who knows, maybe when 2037 finally comes, they will sign another new agreement. What's more, if you search for how many Louvre are in the world, you will find out there are not just 2, but 3 Louvre museums. The other one is located in Lens, and it is called Louvrelens. The 21st centuries mark a pivotal moment for the Louvre, because the Louvre is no longer this or this. The Louvre is no longer located in Paris. It becomes a brand name that you can slap on. And remember the idea of non-collecting museum? Well, the other Louvre museum is allowed to hold temporary exhibitions featuring artwork from the original Louvre museum. So at this point, we must ask, what should the comic draws? Because Louvre don't just look like this in modern day. It also look like these and these. Even the artwork might not stay. And technically, Google is wrong when it says there are 3 Louvre in the world, because currently there are 4 Louvre. The 4th Louvre lives in the digital world. I have said that artists have the chance to visit Louvre at any time after they join BD Louvre. But when I was reading one of the manga that was created by a Taiwanese artist, I was surprised to find out he didn't step foot in the Louvre to create the manga. He just finds some information about the Louvre and piece things together like a giant puzzle. Our public perception, our rough image of the Louvre is enough. At this point, where is the Louvre Museum heading? Is it just a name? A name that we don't even know what it means. This reminds me of the Obscure Cities. The creator encountered something intriguing after they created a character named Mary. They started to receive letters from someone in real life claiming that she is married. They thought this was interesting, so they exchanged letters with that mysterious person for a while. They never found out who that person was, but it certainly is a fascinating tale. After you give a name to something, no one knows who is entitled to that name. And because of frequency illusion, I started to find patterns elsewhere. Louvreabudhabi, Louvrelens. Isn't this just a museum of a museum? This sentiment is echoed in the very first comic that I have read. Themuseumvaults is about an expert who went into a half-ruined museum. And in one of the scenes, we see the expert dreaming about a room where all the paintings are just copies. Imagine an infinite painting, a painting of museum, painting of etc. And we were part of them, and all of these paintings were nothing but copies. The Museum Louvre, the Museum of the Louvre. Isn't that what's happening right now? These bring us to the question, what is a museum? And what is it about if not its own collection?